Today we're talking about best practices in engineering migrations. So specifically what we want to cover is how to handle those complex migrations and these complex scenarios where you might have different systems and different vendors, what the common risks and challenges you might see in migrating these systems, and ways to align your goals with those challenges and really provide the best value to your business and make sure you smooth the transition into your new PLM system. And then finally, some PROSTEP tools and customer experiences with engineering migrations. A little bit about PROSTEP. So we are a vendor-neutral, independent software services company providing interoperability in engineering for about 24 years, so since 1993. Our main products are at the top. OpenPDM is an interoperability, integration, and migration tool that provides connectors to different PLM systems in order to move data in and out. OpenDesk, we provide a CAD translation as a service and also delivery to OEMs and other engineering companies. OpenPDM, our OpenDXM Global X, this is a OpenDXM, a CAD translation workflow engine, along with a supplier integration portal. And then our 3D PDF products, 3D PDF Pro provides animation capabilities to 3D PDFs. And then 3D PDF Generator is a server-side solution that integrates with PLM to automate the generation of 3D PDFs and populate the metadata, do all sorts of great stuff with that. So a little interesting note about PROSTEP being kind of vendor neutral. We are actually owned by the companies at the bottom. So we were set up as a consortium, and there was a working group in automotive in Europe in the 80s. And from that working group, they wanted to fix CAD data and engineering data being too expensive and too cumbersome to move between organizations. And so PROSTEP IVIP, a nonprofit company in the bottom right, was founded out of that. They do standards in engineering data exchange. And PROSTEP AG and PROSTEP Inc. Were founded out of that as well, and we provide software and services to do that type of migration, integration, and data exchange and conversion. So also being neutral, we have quite a few different technology partners and some other vendors, might focus on one or two. We are really partners with everyone within this space, which gives us a wide range of knowledge and compatibility with all these. So major systems may be provided by Dassault Systems or Siemens or PTC, but also SAP, Autodesk, and Aris, and others. And then also simulation data management systems, ERP systems. We're partnered with Adobe with our 3D PDF products, and TechSoft for 3D PDF translation, and others. So a little bit of our agenda. We're going to first start and talk about the challenges that we see in PLM migration. After that, we're going to discuss what are the different strategies, technical strategies, business strategies in order to handle that migration. Then talk about a little bit of planning, and then PROSTEP migration tools. So first, kind of a big overview of PLM system migration. Is a concept of what kind of questions that you need to raise in order to start to be prepared for these types of migrations. Are you realigning your system to or are you going to another of the same system or realigning to a new system? What other third-party interfaces might exist for that? So that could be an ERP interface or another type of system that needs to consume data and is integrated already with the existing one or needs to be integrated with a new one. That type of data alignment. what processes that you might need to integrate with these systems. So, you know, how you're going to share that, how you're going to consume it, what are the internal workflows that need to exist, and then how the data needs to align into those internal workflows. Organizationally, what your time frame looks like, you know, what are those hard deadlines that you need to meet for your business, you know, what are the resources and budget planning that you might need to have, how you're going to transition your business, and, you know, what are you going to do in the meantime when you're in this migration phase, planning for that business to not see any disruption during that time period. You know, how much data you want to carry over, what are the quality of the data, do you want to migrate everything, and is there a large transformation of old data to fit the new processes? And this might be, you know, to different schemas of the PLM, because, you know, different systems handle things. One might have a part, one might have an item. Or, you know, also data conversion, like CAD data conversion, or moving up to a new revision of CAD data or something of that nature. So one thing I always like to do in talking about migration is really, you know, when people start discussing migration, they think about, I'm moving A to B. And that might not always be the perfect case scenario for migration. What is probably good to do, and I like to inform people to do, is think about how you can decommission your old PLM environment and what you need to get moving in the new one. And so that means a couple of different things. One, there could be a third-party system that you're going to archive stuff to, right? Or maybe your legacy PLM, you want to keep that around as an archive, even though you have to keep licenses and hardware around or something like that. But, you know, you can scope it appropriately because you might not need all that data. That data might be better served in another location that is, you know, not going to be necessary to move in another migration later on, like a low-tar, a long-term archive. You know, maybe you don't need all those past iterations or versions of that release data. Maybe you just need what that release data is in order to service, you know, your legal concerns and your customers and what you're currently producing. So separating those two, not into just one migration project, but how do I decommission the old system? What do I need to save out of there? What do I need to use? And how do I set up the new system, and what does business need to be productive? And if you focus on that, then you're probably going to get a different result than I'm just going A to B. Yeah. A little bit about planning. So typically when you're introducing a new PLM, there's going to be a lot of parallel development. There's going to be a lot of dependency between the migration or a third-party integration to the development that's already existing in that PLM today. So that's sometimes a moving target. Yeah, you're going to have maybe a new configuration in your new PLM. You know, you change attributes, you change structure, you introduce new concepts. You know, you might change how projects are managed, or how changes are managed, or something of that nature. And you're going to need to be able to have your migration tool be capable of handling that, and your other integrations for a Coexistence or ERP to be able to handle that. And that means really a synchronized release schedule. That means in development, don't forget about all those other dependencies. Make sure that these things are done in parallel. Also, make sure that you understand that new system. A lot of times we see people who are enterprises that are introducing new systems, and they really don't understand the nuts and bolts behind it. You know, they see the vendor value add, they've done their bake-off and the proof of concept, but you know, they haven't really effectively used the system, and all the stakeholders that are making decisions about how they want to use the system might not be well informed about how they're going to use it. So they need to know, and everyone needs to be well trained in the new PLM system even before migration planning is starting. Unfortunately, all the business cases for return on investment in a migration are typically with the business cases for that new system as well. So make sure you factor that in when you're starting up and planning for a new system. Some risks that we can try and tackle and plan against, but you should know about. Migration timing, so performance and calculated downtime, and this is something that we can provide different strategies for tackling. Sometimes if you're using a one-time migration, it might be we're going to run it over a weekend, or we got a long break at Christmas, hey, we're going to load that data, or we're going to maybe stage it so there's a more incremental type of migration, or possibly even have a long-term synchronization, what we call coexistence, in order to migrate that data in over time. Obviously, you need to be cognizant of data disaster risks. If you have a live system, you need to have a disaster recovery plan. If the data, even if in the test system it went in 100% perfect, but maybe there's some little changes that you made in production system, make sure that you have a way to revert that before you execute any type of migration. Sometimes, depending on your strategy, you can also mitigate some of those concerns, and we can talk about that a little bit later. And then think about scoping and de-scoping. Quite frankly, a lot of times solutions are to de-scope, what the data is to be moved over. And that might not be good for your business, but it might not impact it either. But make sure you know what's realistic to be brought over. There are data model differences between systems, and sometimes a version history and an iteration history doesn't match up entirely right. Things like that. And figure that out, know what you're getting into within the strategy phase before you write down the start development of your migration projects. Finally, migration acceptance. So, one of the biggest parts to this whole thing is kind of planning that your user base that's being migrated to the new system understands the system well, and is capable of using that, right? And that PR campaign, the public relations campaign, I think is vital to an introduction to any user community that's going to be moving along. That they're trained well, that they know what the business value is of that new system, and that they buy into it, and that their voice is heard, that they get brought to the table, more or less immediately, right, as a stakeholder, so that they feel as if they have some interest in this, right? Sometimes there are other things that you need to plan for, like third-party integrations. You could have an MRP ERP integration on your legacy system. You need to plan to test that, with migrated data, with a new schema, and that can definitely complicate things. ERP data is always vital. Alignment with that through the PLM to ensure that the same type of processes are handled correctly. Make sure that the solution is, comprehensive and bug-free. If you're looking at a large enterprise, there are different types of methods that you can perform a migration in order to slowly move your user base over that can get some more traction, more acceptance, and provide a little bit more stable of an environment when you have a wider audience and a wider user base that you're going to be migrating over. Yeah. So at this time, what we'd like to do is start the discussion, and we're going to do that by doing a few surveys and a discussion period. And I'd like to turn it over to Paul Downing, and I think he can lead us through that.
Thanks, Brian. We want to make this a little more interactive, right? So probably you've all attended webinars in the past, and those are more people just talking at you for an hour, and that's not our goal. So our hope, everybody can participate, and what we're going to try to do is foster those discussions. by asking you a series of quick questions, and then as we ask you those questions, get your responses, share your responses in aggregate, right? So we're not going to disclose any personal information, who said what, don't worry about that. But again, we just want to foster that discussion about these various topics. After we ask you a couple questions, then we'll open it up for kind of open mic discussion. And when we get to that point, of course, as you can imagine, if there's hundreds of people on the call, we can't open up all the mics at once. And so we would ask, as questions come to mind, either use the question part of the control panel on your GoToMeeting dialog box, or use your raise your hand, and then we'll unmute your mic and call you. So kind of an experiment for us to see how interactive we can make this, but I think the more that people participate, the more interesting it will be. So let me launch the first question here. And what we want to know, or what we always ask in these webinars, and we've been doing these for well over 10 years now, and the responses always seem to change from time to time. But the first question is, what system are you migrating to? So in this case, we just have a single answer response. Hopefully you're only migrating to one system. We know that might not always be the case. But anything's in the Siemens family, anything's in the Dassault family, anything in the PTC family, anything in the Aris, for example, or some others. So there's too many systems here to list, obviously, and we're limited a little bit by the tool in terms of how many choices we can give you. But we thought this is kind of a good spread. So we're going to give people just another couple seconds here to answer this survey question, make sure we got a good sampling. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and turn off this survey and then share the results with you. And this is kind of how we expect these things to go. So you can see from the results standpoint, maybe some bad news for Siemens, or maybe we just didn't hit the Siemens community enough. But the majority of the people are either going to Dassault, or going to PTC, or going to other. So it's an interesting data point, but it gives us a chance to kind of tailor the communication to the people that are on the phone. Okay, so pretty easy so far. Let's bring up the next one in line. Advance the screen. Okay, survey number 2 coming right up. Well, as you can imagine, first we asked you what you were migrating to. Now we want to kind of share with everybody what you're migrating from. In this case, it's a multi-select. So people oftentimes are going from more than one system to another system. Again, we'll give people a chance to select here. All right. And one of the things on the other, people oftentimes that we find are coming from flat files or spreadsheets, or just, this could be a whole bunch of different things. Smaller systems, homegrown systems, anything along those lines. So let's share those results with everybody. And this is pretty typical. This is more of a normal distribution where we see everybody coming from everything, right? And this is one of, we'll get into this topic in a little bit, but I always find fascinating that you usually have an equal number of people migrating from Siemens and to Dassault as you do have from Dassault going to Siemens, or from PTC to Dassault, or what have you. And so that distribution is pretty flat across all of them. So everybody's leaving everything, I guess, is the short takeaway from that. I think we've got just a couple more in this section. And here's the question, right? So this is the million-dollar question. Why are you migrating to a new system? And there's a million reasons. The most common one, they're kind of listed in order, but we typically see is your old system is out of maintenance and you need to make a change. Maybe you acquired somebody or were acquired yourself. Maybe you're experiencing some performance issues. Perhaps the cost of operating your old system is too high, or maybe you're having some service issues with your existing service provider. The answers are as varied as there are companies out there, and a lot of times when we really dig down to talking with our customers that we consult with, the answer is the perception that the grass is always greener on the other side, right? So, you know, PLM systems, these are big, complex things, right? Engineering is big and complex. Don't let anybody tell you anything differently. And I think sometimes people just reach a saturation point or an overload point where, like, okay, if I have to look at this screen from system vendor A one more time, I'm going to scream, I'm going to throw it out and start with a clean slate, right? And there are cases where, you know, that's a good thing to do. So let's see what the results look like. So a large number of people that are on the call today, they have an old system, and I can't really tell who is selecting multiples, but if I had to make a guess, those two are kind of hand in hand, right? It's an old system and it's expensive, and they don't want to maintain that old system, so they're looking for alternatives to reduce cost. And then you've got the normal smattering, if you will, of mergers and stability and vendor issues in there. So I'm hoping these are interesting and useful to everybody that's on the call. The next thing we want to do is try to open this up a little bit more into a discussion, right? So Brian has shared with us some of the reasons or the strategies behind migrating, some of the risk involved behind migrating, the importance of acceptance. Again, in the spirit of kind of a workshop and interactivity, I guess we'd like to hear from you all in terms of what do you think on these topics? Where are they headed? Okay, I do see one question here. It's someone typed it in. They're shy, didn't want to speak live, or they're in a common area. And I'm going to paraphrase this because the questions get to be pretty long. But basically, it says, okay, Brian, you talked about the importance of awareness and acceptance and buy-in throughout the enterprise. Do you have any advice on how to foster that, how to increase adoption and awareness?
Yeah. So I think that actually starts within the project planning itself, right in the beginning. Being able to go out to that entire community, that big user group, those people that are going to be using the new system, and bring those in as stakeholders. You know, they might not be the final say in process and requirements, but you need to have advocates out there for your system. I'd also recommend that you focus on key users, bring them into the project early. These might be from one person from each department that's going to be adopting it, and make them power users. Go through the advanced training. Make sure that they're able to answer questions that the other people in the department can rely on them in order to know what the process is and how to use the system. So they can go ahead and help the adoption of that new PLM system. But certainly, make sure they know the value of the new system, what advantages that system brings, and bring people in early and have their voices heard.
Okay. Any other questions out there that people might have?
We do have one coming in on the chat box here, and I can read it out. So the question is, when dealing with multiple PLM systems, one of which is out of date, what are the steps forward to implement both systems? I.e., Teamcenter is out of date and Innovia is still up to date. Only want to update the out-of-date Teamcenter. And this is from Jacob. Jacob, I don't know if you wanted to speak, but go ahead and...
Yeah. So sometimes there is synchronization that happens because enterprises use systems for different purposes. Like Teamcenter could be your team data manager, housing just your CAD data, and maybe Innovia is your backbone PLM system that handles change and and BOM and things like that. And you know, there is a alignment that needs to happen between those systems and the integration that goes on between those two. Certainly you need to synchronize the development and release cycles between those. Sometimes if you want to keep both systems, do an in-place upgrade of the Teamcenter environments and test out the integration that goes in the Teamcenter environment. You might have changed you know, your document model or something like that between those systems, and you know, make sure that that stuff works within the test and the upgrade and the integration before going live. Hopefully I answered your question, but you know, yeah, that's what I would see: in-place upgrade and good regression testing on the integration.
Good. You know, it seems everybody's really shy to talk, which is okay. And we have one more question, I think, that is from Santosh. And basically, he's talking about keeping NX data in Teamcenter and CATIA data in Innovia to have maximum compatibility in those two systems. I'm not sure if the question is about interoperability then and how we move data between those two, or translation, but you know, what do you feel about keeping the native data in the native system as opposed to managing CATIA in Teamcenter, for example?
Yeah, I think that you're capable of doing that. I think that it typically would be better managed within a single system for a multi-CAD scenario. If you have a lot of CAD that's intertwined and dependent on each other between NX and CATIA, then you know, I would recommend kind of focusing on a single system. There's also, I guess, I'm a big believer in lightweights, so having an enterprise strategy to adopt, you know, maybe JT or 3D XML or another type of design space lightweight that could be easily transported between those systems would, you know, give you, you know, multi-CAD authoring capability. You know, if that design is owned in one, they generate the lightweight and send it over to the other so it can be consumed. You know, but in the end, you will get into complicated scenarios about ownership and authoring tools and where you can author, and you know, and it can get a little complicated if you don't have a single design system. Lightweight formats are definitely, you know, something that we like to focus on, and archiving formats as well here at PROSTEP. I think they add a lot of enterprise value to your PLM system, more than most actually see originally. And you have to be a little bit concerned about, if you're using more than one system, yeah, how the integration is going to go, and if the compatibility is there, you know, between your lightweight or between native data and your CAD authoring system. And so if you focus on just Teamcenter or Innovia as the repository for that, I think you're going to get a better data management of the master data, and better analysis of what's changed between data. You know, you have change management that you can then incorporate that is encompassing both sets of data in one system, that doesn't need a big integration, stuff like that. Yeah. So there's more value, I think, in consolidation, especially when you're talking about dependencies in these CAD authoring tools. Now, on the other hand, if these are different products entirely and you're delivering to different customers, and you might have common bolts or nuts that are, you know, shared, you know, but nothing but really the base component library, then, you know, it's okay to keep those different systems. Yeah, but, you know, watch that dependency. All right. So anything else? No? Good. All right. So finding the optimal migration strategy. let's talk a little bit about roadmaps and then discuss different strategies that we might be able to use, different technical strategies and different migration strategies in order to best accomplish your goal. So first, if we have a PLM roadmap, generically what you want to do is find the right PLM, find the right migration tool, have the right fit for what your enterprise might look like. After that, you're going to start talking about workflows, big PLM concepts, I guess, how to use vendor data, how to use supplier data, business process alignments, maybe the business changes to the PLM alignment, and selecting a migration strategy, I think, should be part of this to-be definition for PLM. Then RFPs, hardware software procurement, doing a system definition, and then starting your migration project planning at that point in time. And then following implementation, doing the configuration and customization of those, aligning your third-party integrations, ERP, MRP, other types of integrations, and then implementation of data conversion and migration tools following with that, and then user acceptance testing, training, migration dry runs, migration rehearsals, and rollout, and then finally, updates if you're doing a staged migration or an incremental migration or a coexistence, then a continuous update, and then a rollout to the end users based on if you want to move that user community all at once or over time. So we typically talk about migration methods technically in two different terms. One is what we call an ETL, extract, transform, and load. And the second is what we're calling transactional, which moves one package at a time. And so for an ETL, the steps are, you have your extract, you take what's in that source PLM system, you pull out all the metadata and put it in an outside repository, you pull out the CAD data and other documents and other binary data, you put that on the store, you then transform that data if it needs to be, and then you, in one shot typically, load that target PLM system. And so this can be defined also that you can have an update, meaning that you might do different extracts and because of the way things are loaded, you might not have all the current data right before the production migration. You want to stage things, and so it could be that there's maybe 2 extracts, transforms, and load before the new users come into that new system to make sure all the data is synchronized properly with a delta update. So, and then the second migration method is what we call transactional. So what you're doing is kind of defining packages, and package could be like all the data you need for a certain business unit, or all the data you need in order to use a certain feature set. Yeah, so it could be that I just want to use bombs, and I want all my bill of information in that system, but I'm not doing change yet, right? So you can synchronize all that. Or my program A or program B needs to be using a new system in that user base, so they need all the data, all the CAD data, all the change data, all the relevant data that goes to what that set is, and then you can migrate that over. So that is kind of a package definition. But in a transactional, you would export map and import those small packages, and you would do that over time. And this could do one way, meaning I want to move users and not bring over data and just lock the data in the source system. You could also do it two-way, meaning that you can move the data into the target system, but then change ownership to the target system when it needs to be, and then synchronize stuff that's owned in the target system back to the source. And that would be what we call a coexistence type scenario. And so there's two types of methods that we use, and these are kind of in combination. There's an ETL and transactional, and that's a technical strategy, and then there's a method, and we call this a one-time or a coexistence migration. Key difference in this is that the fixed time period here for a one-time migration, what you want to do is strategically decommission that old system on a Friday. All the users go in and they log off for the last time in the old system, and then on Monday morning they log into the new system, and then everybody in the whole user community is pushed over. The ERP integration turns off on Friday, and the new ERP integration turns on Monday, and that can be good, and I think this is traditionally how people run migrations. And it works out for smaller migration projects, but dependency on the size of your enterprise and your user community and the complexity, that could be a big challenge to synchronize all those things into a one fixed time period event. The other one we call coexistence, is where you have your legacy system productive and you slowly decrease the user base. And this could be over months or over years, where you have users that are still using the old system, and then in groups, define kind of on how you want to define your package of data that you want to synchronize over. You start moving them over to the new productive system, and then they start moving data into there and using the data over time. Now, this obviously has a lot of advantages to moving large enterprises with large user communities. Lots of different types of users use PLM systems, so it could be that the tooling guys and the engineering guys and the design guys might do this at different times, or whatever you have. But it could be that there's different good reasons to use both of these. And we're going to go into those. So for ETL and transactional, I think the big benefits to an ETL type migration is to be able to modify and correct issues in the staging database. This is the big one. So if you need to do a lot of cleanup of the data before you go in and push it in, this is not a bad way to do that. Because it's a one-time event, there's no really going backwards. And no compatibility in that, but that's okay because it's going to fit better in the new system. It's also typically got better performance than transactional. It's good for migration rehearsals, and it has really high quality results for a first go live for a new PLM, meaning that I need an initial load. This is a pretty good way to do that. Risks are if you keep this around, the staging database can get out of sync. And that might be that people are adding new data into the source and you need to add that data there. Or if you have like an update migration, something that gets deleted. This is it's complicated to keep that in line, and it's not tuned well for repeatable transactions typically. It means export and import is done twice because typically we would use an export and then we would do a mapping from a source database to another database, intermediate database, and that mapping is done internally, and the cleanup is done internally if you want to modify data, and then there's an import. So there's a little bit more risk and a little bit more not risk but work that needs to go into that. In order to make it happen, and typically, the migration might not always sync up to going backwards or going back to a third-party integration, right? So this is also part of the testing. But if you do a bulk migration, you have to be 100% sure with 100% of your data the first time. And make sure that's very thoroughly vetted. Whereas if you use something like a coexistence, then there's a little bit less risk and leeway for errors. So coexistence enables that staged migration might be, and easier adoption. You don't need to move over everybody on day one. There's easier control over errors, yeah, because it's not just one time, I'm going to move 100%. I'm going to move 1% and I'm going to do that 100 times, right? And you can fix that error, that little error on the 1%, and then, repeat it again imperfectly. And it enables you to move your migration, really at your pace of the business. And if not everyone is trained on day one, not every division or every user is capable of using the system, then you can slowly phase them in and teach them how to use it, and that works out well. Some of the risks, unlike in ETL, garbage in, garbage out, there's not that intermediate database where you can go in and clean stuff up, and you're going to see that that could be an issue that you might need to correct. You might not know exactly what order you need to import the data without doing a thorough vetting, and that is because sometimes data has dependencies on each other, and you need to really examine those dependencies in order to see that the order is correct. Obviously, the performance is not over a weekend. It's typically done slower, and it needs to be tested and retested when there's a new version of your new PLM system, or there's issues that come out, or old PLM system gets updated, or you have a new type of CAD or something like that. Definitely you need a lot more testing, and it needs to be ongoing, whereas an ETL is really just a 100% data migration rehearsal. Yeah. So kind of updating and a strategy option. This one-time migration, you do it over a weekend. It could be, we could do this transactionally, or you can do this with an ETL. We have what we call an update until go live one-time migration. This is, a test, and then retest, and then, execute that initial migration, and then do a little bit of an update just before you go live. And so for larger data sets, or systems that have poor performance, typically this is a strategy that we can use, both ETL or transactional. Staged and coexistence, this is moving things in chunk at a time, flexible. These are both really only well viable with a transactional type of strategy. And it gives you time in order to fix things up and move users in as they're ready to be moved in. So that takes us actually to our second discussion set and our survey number 4, and I'll turn it over to Paul.
Thanks, Brian. So there's a lot of strategy things to consider there, a lot of topics, and one of the things we wanted to get a feel for and share with everybody again on the phone is kind of where everybody is at, because everyone starts with their own tipping point, if you will. So when we look at where you're at with your project, what we want to do is share with the audience kind of where you're at. Are you just researching at this point? Are you you've kind of started the project and feeling your way through some of the technical issues and topics? Are you running into some issues on your project? Or is everything going fantastic? I assume if it is, you might not be on the call. Or do you see some major issues down the road? So it's always interesting. Like I said, everybody's kind of coming at this from a different point, and a lot of times we try to time these webinars early in the year and late in the year so that people who are just starting their projects have a chance to kind of see the big picture. And at the end of the year, as they start planning new projects for the upcoming year. But again, we always run into people that, hey, this has been running for 6 months, and we see the light at the end of the tunnel, but it's a train coming right at us, right? So this is hard stuff. Let me share the results, and that's good. I guess it's good to see so many people that are trying to get a head start, right? It's always better to do some research before you jump headlong into the project, and that's perfect, and that's why we run these sessions, really, to kind of help point you in the right direction, give you some tips, and learn from our experience at PROSTEP doing this for more than 20 years. Let me hide that one. Our next question. So again, Brian mentioned a couple of different strategies, and based on what you've heard or where your project's already at, again, this is a single select, but where are you leaning in your migration project? Are you still undecided? You don't know if you're thinking of a big bang migration, so to speak, or a bulk load migration, or some sort of coexistence where you can do things a little bit at a time, or are you interested in doing more of a transaction by transaction? This one looks like it's going to be unanimous unless somebody jumps in here. Okay, let's share this one. This is interesting. So it looks like most of the people are either haven't decided, which is fine, or they're really thinking about a bulk load. And that's good. You know, we do all of them. There isn't any one right answer between a bulk load, between a coexistence, and again, certainly if you're not decided, then you're at the right place, right? The last one in this section, I believe, is you know, what do you see as the largest risk for your migration? So another way to phrase this is, what are you most worried about, or what is the business most worried about, or what do you think is going to have the largest impact to your business? So we run the gamut here. This is a multi-select, so it could be any one of these or all of these, or something different. There's a million reasons why you might be worried. You know, probably the number one thing that we run into is just the timing. The thing that we encourage you to look at within your organization is make sure you leave enough time for migration. Too often people are so busy installing the new system that they don't have time to think about migration, and then unfortunately more often than people might care to realize, it gets to be 2 weeks before go live and people are oops, we've got all this data, how the heck do we get that from system A to system B? There's not a magic button to push. So I can't tell you how many panicked calls we get, you know, 2 weeks before go live that says, oh, we didn't figure out how to get the data out of system A into system B. And at that point, honestly, unless you've only got a small sampling of data, it's too late. You know, you're not going to meet your go live objectives if your go live objective is to have more data. Let's share those results. And it seems like the number one concern, which is not unusual, is reconciling differences between systems, right? Dealing with conflict management. I've got moving targets, maybe both systems are live is usually how we interpret this, and how do we merge data between different systems and try to avoid conflicts. You know, the next ones that are more or less tied are timing, budgets, in-house technical skills, right? So again, I think these things are really interesting just to share with people, and if nothing else, you can see you're not alone on some of these. Again, we want to open this up for a workshop discussion on these topics. I know that we had a couple people, several people join in after we got started, so when we get to the workshop discussion area, you can either ask a question via text in the question section of the control panel, or you can raise your hand and we can unmute your microphone and speak to you live. I do see I've got one question already, and I'm going to try to summarize it here, but if I could summarize it, we're a small company. We don't have a lot of objects, maybe 10 to 20,000 objects in their old system, and they're looking at trying to make a decision, is it best to do some sort of incremental migration or some sort of bulk migration? I guess the question really is about, where's the tipping point? Where do you draw the line? Is it the number of objects? Is there something else?
Yeah. So I think, you know, it largely comes down to how fast you can steer your enterprise, right? And so conventional migration, I think most people think of ETL, and if you have a small set of users and you have a small set of data, that's probably best targeted towards an ETL migration. But if you have more complicated enterprise with a large user community and not everything is worked out or working well day one, then I would steer towards a coexistence. But yeah, for small communities, small data sets, definitely one-time migration is the way to go.
Yeah, Brian, you bring up a good point about training, and that's the other thing to consider with a bulk migration, right? If you have a very large enterprise and you've got thousands of users to train or even hundreds of users to train, trying to do that far enough of advance where it's useful is a big challenge, right? So we run into situations all the time where companies put in, we're going to have a dedicated training for the next 6 months, and part of your objectives is to go to, I'll just make something up, Teamcenter training. And the people who started in month 1 of those 6 months, by the time it comes to go live, which oftentimes is delayed for whatever reason, let's say a year later, they've forgotten everything they learned, right? Or they've got a certificate that they pinned in their cube, or they've got a big binder that they've stuck in their cube of what the new Teamcenter looks like. And that's great for the checkbox, but this is another thing that sometimes might lend itself to consider an incremental migration. If you have a high number of users, start with a department of 10 users, and then let those 10 users train another 10 users, or at least if you start in digestible chunks, they can start using the system immediately, as opposed to attending a 3-day workshop and forgetting it all, by the time they get back to their desk.
Yeah, and to add to that, there really isn't a really great time in order to train them. I mean, they need, in order to make decisions on how they want the system to work, because it's important to their business function, they need to know how the system works early. And then, later on, when they go to being productive, maybe 6 months down the road, they also need to know how the system works. So really, getting those key users engaged, those key stakeholders that can really help disseminate that information and know their business function well early is really key to setting up the PLM and to executing the migration. Yeah.
Okay. I don't have any other questions coming in at this time, so if you think of some as we go along, just type them into the question box and we'll try to work them in. But with that, we'll continue on.
Great. All right. So let's talk about a little bit of migration planning advice. And this is really what we were talking about before. This is, how you might want to align and, what the KPIs are versus, what we would recommend. And, if we want to have a one-time migration, typically that has more disaster risks. It has a little bit more acceptance risks. It's easier, right? It's one direction. Yeah, and it lends itself well to a smaller PLM project because frankly it costs less, and it's easy to get the data in. What we have in the middle of the stage migration is maybe somewhere between a delta update or a package transfer of some of the data, and that kind of bridges the gap where you can separate those a little bit more. And kind of limit some of those risks that come along with that migration and that acceptance. And then finally, coexistence, which takes longer. There's higher costs to it, but you can distribute the risk a little bit better, and it lends itself to larger PLM projects. So some of the risks that we see in one-time migration is be prepared for that disaster recovery. Make sure you have that backup system. Make sure that all the users have accepted the new system, that all the interfaces are in place. And if you have some complicated dependencies, and these might be tough to overcome in a one-time migration, such as a third-party interface. And then also continuity. So make sure that you have the same people testing, developing, testing, and executing, I think, for one time. Actually, that's really for everyone. But long-term coexistence migration, I think holding to the timeline is important, right? Sometimes there's too much comfort in your old system, and the business manages to keep that alive for too long. And this is a big risk for coexistence, that they don't push and stress that you need to adopt the new system quicker because you have the means to keep it around. And so that's going to extend the cost because you need to update both and you need to move the transaction. So keep to your timeline. In a transactional data migration, not all the data is executed in a test either. So you're going to come up with new unique errors, maybe data conditions or problems like that when you're executing that. Now it could be that you resolve that error and you don't see it later, and so you might have one or two instead of the entire database failing. And that works. That works pretty well. You can mitigate that by running it in a test environment, and so if you want to have a Delta update or a new package, execute that against a new production environment, kind of like you might within a stage environment or an ETL type stage environment. A little bit of advice on project planning. So for one-time migrations, make sure you start with a strategy workshop. Make sure you have all your stakeholders there. Test all those basic migration use cases with system testing, like after they're developed. Execute what we call a migration rehearsal. And so a migration rehearsal would start with a limited set of data, even a large data set, but a limited set of data to test functionality, and then execution of 100% of that data within a test environment, and that will give you specific errors. It will show you if there's degradation of performance over time, and it will enable you to come up with a good execution plan later on for a one-time migration. For coexistence, we think that you should use maybe a development over time. So you start with some strategy and workshop and iterate on this. Implement some specific use cases. You start with parts and BOMs and documents. You move to CAD and other stuff. Execute that user acceptance for that incremental functionality. Make sure you have unit tests and system integration tests that you can repeat and regression testing for later. And then execute that increment or that coexistence. Turn that system on so it starts synchronizing data over to the new system. And then keep fixing any issue you might have with that, and then add new user back. Sorry about that. Unfortunately, my data connection cut out there for a second, so hopefully you can hear me again. I'd like to continue with some system-specific technical advice. So this could be technical considerations for these different systems. And this is kind of a DIY, as well as, some of the technology that exists today. And then, PROSTEP also has tools that can utilize a lot of these interfaces, streamline, the development and, the migration path. So for Teamcenter, specifically, You know, for interfacing, you know, you have the Teamcenter SOA, and then there's also for legacy, Teamcenter Portal Client API. Those are good interfaces for getting data in. It goes through the business layer. It respects your rules. There's an IPS tool for CSV loading for metadata, and also PLM XML, which is kind of a Siemens format of XML for doing things like document import and export. And these support different features. Like if you want to move in users, you probably need to use something like a PLM XML or a client, a SOA API. If you want to move in data, you probably want to use you know, a SOA API again, or IPS. You know, IPS does not work well at all, really, with moving in CAD data. So you need to use another tool for that. For UGNX data, UG clone. For CATIA data, TCIC, and for Creo data, there's a IPEM command line import-export tool. And these are the standard interfaces for the data that you need in Teamcenter. And so, you know, you need to reuse and respect that interface for a couple different reasons. One is that, you know, if you do it through just the back end of the database, you know, it might not be in there correctly, and, you know, maybe legally it voids your warranty on the data that you put in there because you didn't put it in through the interface effectively. But you know, this is the best way in order to get CAD data in, is through the native interface in a batch mode. So PROSTEP has tools that work on all of these interfaces, and we're going to use the best tool for the job in order to load that data. And so we have a commercial offering for each of these individually. You know, sometimes, you know, with Teamcenter, data creation performance is an issue. You know, it takes a while in order to start sessions, in order to load data, and so you need to plan for that type of stuff. And then also, historic data is sometimes challenging in Teamcenter, and because of the data model, because they don't have a separate, well, depending on how you implement it, but they don't separate effectively CAD data with the engineering BOM, you know, depending if you want to use multiple BOM views, or they don't separate, you know, the documents and the parts data as much as they might in other systems. There is schema issues sometimes when migrating to Teamcenter, so you need to be cognizant of that type of stuff. For Windchill, you know, interfacing with Windchill, RMI is I think the core one. There's also you know, legacy WebJets and other things. They provide a bulk migrator for Creo and metadata and other documents that you can get from them, and we have a controller that we can use in order to load that bulk migrator from your legacy system. For getting CAD data in, if you're not using a bulk migrator, you want to use the Workgroup Manager batch import. We have a batch import controller for that. Or for just Creo data, you know, you can use Pro Toolkit or JLink, something of that nature, in order to load that, which is in effect similar to the Workgroup Manager batch tools. We also have comprehensive tools for covering these within Windchill bulk load. For 3D Experience, Innovia, we use RMI API for V6 and CATIA V5 for import-exports, so that's sufficient. MQL scripting, Tickle scripting, and you know, that could also be done over RMI for better control. You know, newer CAD integrations you need to watch out for. CATIA V6, some CATIA V5 does not work with MQL, and so there's specifically new APIs for handling that data. PROSTEP has a specific XPDM adapter for Windchill, for SAP, and for some other systems for populating CATIA V6 data between there in order to integrate that data. Some things you want to watch out for is these model dependencies. So you're going to find when you try and load this data, if attributes aren't set correctly or relationships aren't intertwined with objects that you don't think are important, but the system thinks are important, your UI isn't going to function properly. And that might mean, building extensive version history and relationships there, or dependencies on programs or other things, right? But there are object model dependencies in order for this thing to run that aren't transparent or as transparent as they are in other systems. Make sure you understand the object models in the database. They're good to look through in the old thick client, and figure that out there. And it can be loaded pretty quickly if you wanted to, and if the system performs well. Yeah. Finally, we have some technical considerations. I might have another one after this for CAD-based file import. And this is if you have a bunch of CAD on a directory, and then you want to push that CAD into a PLM system. Typically we have a process where you have an CAD interrogation tool, and really you run two processes. You evaluate your CAD data, and then it spits out an Excel, and then in that Excel you want to add PLM data to it. So the CAD data doesn't know, what group and what ownership and what release status. Sometimes it doesn't. It has, and so you need to add some specific PLM data to that, and then you can go ahead in combination with the Excel and the CAD data, push that into your new system. You got to watch out. Typically, that data that's stored on that drive is dirtier. There's a lot of repeat parts in my experience, meaning people just copy release data, and so you might have that bolt 100 times, and as a release master release CAD within a directory and used in different places, and you don't know which one is the actual that you can use because they're all a little bit different. And so you might have to have some reconciliation if you want to use that same CAD within different assemblies that are going to be pushed in. This is easier to manage, and it's a batch transaction, but I know that it's not so complicated on the IT perspective. Really, it's filling out that Excel in the middle that pretty much always gets people into trouble, because they need to identify tens of thousands of CAD objects, what all the ownership is, what program they go to, and all that other stuff. So be ready for engineering to step in as a big role to identify that data in the middle. Yeah. A note about neutral formats. So obviously we are PROSTEP, and PROSTEP, the nonprofit sister company of ours, leads a lot of these engineering neutral format definitions. That could be like AP 214, 239, 242. That's PLM services and PLCS and the new STEP 242. Also things like OpenJT and LOTAR and other working groups that they might have. And so we're well connected with neutral formats. It's beneficial for exchanging data, for legacy data, for archiving data. The standards there, so you're always going to be able to open it because it's written down how it exists, and so it should be well supported into the future. Yeah, so lightweight formats are definitely something that can assist, like in the question earlier with the Teamcenter and Novia, or in a multi-CAD environment, or using design space with a supplier, something of that nature, are definitely something that you should focus on and look at in your enterprise if you're not utilizing to its full potential today. Neutral formats, and I'm not talking about CAD data, I'm talking about like metadata formats, generally aren't good for migration. So, if you don't want to export into STEP AP 214 automotive data exchange in order to run a migration, really you want more of a point-to-point solution. You know, it really takes away from that extra layer of abstraction. Now, if you move into, you know, a solution where you have more than two, then it starts to benefit. Yeah, that neutral format is going to benefit. But for a migration, you want to keep it simple. Yeah. And then archiving strategy, long-term archiving and retrieval. This is something we want to talk about as a migration strategy. Remember that decommissioning and starting up the new one, make sure if you don't think about it today that you can think about this because, you know, your CAD formats might not be supported in the future. If you have, you know, very old CAD formats, it needs to be accessible. There's legal requirements and other requirements for that. PROSTEP IVIP does lead the European long-term archiving and retrieval working group. And this is something that should be considered in a migration strategy, is having that archiving system. So we're up to our next survey, and so I'm going to turn it over again to Paul.
Thanks, Brian. Okay, just a couple questions left here. We're rounding up to the end of the webinar here in about 15 minutes, so we'll keep plowing along. And again, I want to thank everybody for their patience and attendance so far. I hope this is interesting. Related to the data, so the previous session with Brian was really talking about dealing with data complexity, multiple sources of data. Thinking about your environment, what do you see as some of the technical challenges related to data complexity? Do you have a lot of data? Do you have maybe not dirty, super clean data, broken links, duplicate parts, things like Brian mentioned? Maybe you just have such an enormous volume of data, it's hard to know where to start. Let me share those results. You know, and again, it's everything, right? These are, we've been doing this a long time, if you can't tell, and these are the hot buttons that most migration projects have. And I'm going to try to move quickly through these to make sure we've got time for everything. The next question is, what is your plan, or what are your thoughts for dealing with legacy data? Are you thinking of just migrating everything all at once and that's it? Whatever we have in the old system, we're going to move it over to the new system? Are you thinking about just working with all releases, the current released data, not worrying about bringing over history per se and every minute change? Are you thinking about just moving some of the data, right, as you need it? We talked about some incremental strategies and maybe just moving things over program by program. Or are you thinking about some sort of archival strategy? We want to archive as much as we can and just migrate the current programs. Show the answers here. Everybody had an opinion on this one, which is great. And this is usually what we run into, right? And so I implore you, I'm sure Brian will do the same, think hard about number one. Right? When we first talk to any customer, this is always their first request. I want to migrate everything I've ever touched in the past 40 years, no matter how good it is, no matter how relevant it is, just in case someday I need it, right? That's great. If you have really deep pockets and you have the internal team to be able to validate all that data, to either clean it up before it comes over or to clean it up as it's coming over or to clean it up after it's come over, more power to you, right? We got to tell you, that is extremely expensive, extremely problematic. It's not a technical challenge at this point. It's more a quality problem, right? So everybody thinks they have to maintain everything in editable format forever, and that might not be the optimal strategy unless you've got a lot of time and a lot of money. Hide that and bring up the next one. We've got two left here as we round into the home stretch. It doesn't have to be archiving per se, but again, the question is, what neutral formats are you using today, right? Specifically, we're talking about migration, but you know, are you using 3D PDF in your company? Are you using some form of STEP in your company? Are you using JT, 3D XML? There are so many different variants. You know, I mean, we couldn't list them all, but we tried to hit the top ones. And especially this comes into play when you're thinking about archiving data. Show these results, and it's everything, right? And that's what we come to expect. You know, one word of advice. You know, what we run into oftentimes when we start talking about archiving strategies is kind of a, if you pardon the expression, a religious war between file formats, right? And so everybody's looking for one format that will be the end-all, be-all for everything going forward till the end of time. And our answer is there probably isn't that one perfect format. You really have to think about use case. What's the purpose down the road? Is it just visual and reference in nature? So 3D PDF might be a good way to do that. Do you think you're going to actually have to edit that data, manipulate that data? Then you might be considering STEP. Do you want something that's got a high degree of plug-in interoperability with other existing native CAD formats? Then you might be looking at JT. Honestly, the answer typically is all of the above, right? Or at least multiple of the above. And because archiving is pretty straightforward and pretty easy nowadays, and these lightweight formats are very robust, there's no reason you can't do more than one. I've got one last question here, and that is relating to CAD translation. So for the most part, what we've been talking about in our migration processes have been PLM data, metadata, reference data, native CAD data. But as you think of dumping an old system and moving into a new system, how are you thinking about handling those, I'm going to say, translation needs? So are you planning to manage foreign native CAD in the new system? So this, I think, harkens back to an earlier question. You know, how do you manage CATIA data inside of Teamcenter, and can you do that robustly? Or how do you manage NX data inside of Innovia, and so on? Are you thinking about converting all of your legacy data into a format such as STEP and moving it over? Or are you thinking about converting native CAD on your legacy side to native CAD on the new side? So are you going to go through a mass conversion process to migrate all your Creo data to NX, for example, or all your NX data to CATIA, or what have you? Or are you thinking about only converting data on current programs, or maybe just doing things on request? Share the results with everybody here. It's a complicated question. I know the answer might be we don't know. We haven't figured it out yet. So there's a lot of people, and this is what we typically advise and what we typically see, right? We're going to manage the foreign native CAD system inside that new environment. And honestly, that makes a lot more sense than trying to convert between neutral formats 100% of your data, right? You have to be realistic that the cost of translating data is extremely expensive and error prone. I mean, there's great tools by a lot of companies. Some of those vendors are on the phone here with us. But it's a big project to make sure you get high fidelity, high quality translations that are properly healed, are properly checked, are properly vetted, especially when you start with data that probably didn't have that level of scrutiny to begin with. Okay, let me hide that and move on to the next one. And again, this is all of what we've been discussing. There's a couple of questions that have come in on this, and let me try to I'll rattle off 3 of them at once, and I think you can kind of intertwine them, and as more come in, we'll get to it. So one question, when we're dealing with different types of different systems, the first one is we're not just dealing with PLM systems, we're not just dealing with engineering systems. We have other systems such as SharePoint or things like that that might be a homegrown system, whatever, that is going to come into play during the migration. So how do we maintain links? How do we make sure that that third non-PLM system isn't lost in the shuffle is one question. The other question is making sure that I think this is the integration of native CAD. If we're managing native CAD like CATIA inside of Teamcenter, right? How do we keep that tight integration with the CAD? And the last one, and again, it's very much related, what functionality might be lost in doing that? So again, if we're managing CATIA data inside of NX or NX data inside of Innovia, what are the risks? What am I going to lose from a linkage perspective?
Sure. So to the first question, I think comes down to kind of multiple sources of data. I think you should outline and make a decision on what data is mastered and what data is able to be inserted to that system at any point in time, right? So if you know that you have a requirement system and you have a PLM system and they're separate, and you want to move both the PLM and the requirements to another PLM, then there's probably appropriate linkage points and references to parts or to other types of requirements in that PLM. But when you're generating those new requirements, you make that source system the master, that data, and when you're moving over the other information, you make that other information. But you should make a determination on which system owns that data before you execute a migration, and which system can update the data. And we sometimes call that an import strategy. Or something of that nature in order to determine where those things are coming from. For intermediate formats and for CAD data, if we're talking about integrations inside different systems, then there are kind of catch-22s to both sides. So if you have a multi-CAD environment in your one PLM system, it does make it easier for those CAD systems to share data effectively without a means of transporting it in the intermediary. That's because that system controls that data, both of them. It can determine which one is the source of the truth. It can also manage, if it's Teamcenter, it can manage JT, or it can manage 3D XML, or some type of intermediate format that can be used in a multi-CAD environment between those different CADs. Now, that's what you gain, right? You might lose in a couple other areas. So depending on the CAD system and the system that you're using, that integration might not be as good as using another system, So yeah, the NX integration for Teamcenter is very robust because it's NX management, right? And the same can be said for each system and how it's used. And some of them are weaker than others, and that's definitely the case. So you might lose some features on the integration. But you also might lose some features on the PLM side. So maybe you have other third-party integrations or other great features benefits that your PLM system, can capture, and those are all definitely good. Yeah. So hopefully I'm going to.
So Brian, we do have one hand raised here. Santosh, I'm going to unmute you. So if you have any questions, you can go ahead and respond. So.
Can you guys hear me okay?
Yep.
Yes, totally.
Okay, cool. Just I was a little worried about that. A couple of my questions are, number one, with regards to things like SharePoint and other application lifecycle management servers. As you know, the whole idea of PLM and PDM came from the software world, where you were managing the software projects and you had multiple teams. You have problems with people overriding each other, so that's how PLM was derived. Now, the software has adopted that same name, but I'm envisioning scenarios where you have mechanical engineers that are actually doing a lot of software development as well, whether it's C and C++ or whatever, because you have systems that are both mechanically driven as well as software driven. So you have to have two different data management type systems. And so my question regards to that is, if you're migrating one from the other for the PDM, but they all have ties into an ALM system, how would you ensure that that doesn't break? And then, regards to my other question, as far as going from one PDM system to another when you have native CAD data, my biggest concern is that, let's just say that I'm currently using NX and I have Teamcenter, and then now I go to Innovia. Well, are there features in Teamcenter that are allow me to maximize the use of the NX data that I will lose when I go to Innovia, because Innovia is geared more towards managing CATIA data, not so much NX data. So I now have lots of functionality, kind of like you're now down to the lowest common denominator, as opposed to being able to take full advantage of the tight integration and being able to do a lot of things because it's made by the same vendor. So those are the two sets of questions I have for you guys.
Yeah, so to follow up on the second one, I think, yeah, definitely you're going to have to do an evaluation of the integration, on a case-by-case basis, because there are some that are very good, and there are some that maybe you are going to lose some features, right? For ALM integration, there are some good tools out there that can preserve some of these relationships and links, right? So we have what we call OSLC adapter. OSLC is a standard protocol that keeps these URIs available between these systems, so you can actually relate the same data and migrate the same data with the same target information through this type of adapter, and it's very widely used in ALM. And so that you can take that source reference and really migrate it, in effect, by reference between those systems. Now that's a little bit more of a cross-integration solution. I don't really want to get into it because of time, but that's something we should definitely talk about if you're interested. Yeah.
One quick follow-up question is, have you guys ever seen scenarios where you've had software projects that are being done in conjunction with CAD projects that you have to talk to each other, not only for driving them, but also for the final product? So let's say you have this mechanical whatever, be an airplane or whatever, and you got like a hypothetical fly-by-wire whatever. So you have to have the two ultimately talking to each other in the final manufactured product. Have you ever seen such scenarios?
Yeah, of course. Systems engineering is based on all sorts of different things, right? There's ALM system. They might handle anything software and software requirements and hardware and everything, right? So it could be circuit boards, even in whatever Gerber files and all sorts of things, right? You might have contract requirements that come from a DORA system. And other things, right? From other systems or manufacturing, MRP feedback, and along with your mechanical stuff. That's traditionally done within a PDM, but doesn't really have to be, right? So really what you can do is there needs to be a strategy outlined in order to either bridge those gaps between an ALM system and a PDM system. Some PDM systems want you to bring a lot of that stuff in. They might have an integration for your software to some extent, or they could have requirements management or something like that. But I would, if you're looking at ALM, I would look at OSLC, and I would also look at more systems engineering definition features within your PLM system provider. Yeah.
What is OSLC?
OSLC is a standard protocol that all the major vendors, so Rational or Altium or all the other vendors, Integrity, utilize in order to provide a real-time relationship link between data artifacts in ALM and external stuff. So it's a big set of URIs, in effect, that you can point to your data and get easy access to it. And that's really another webinar, but we'd have to take that one offline.
Sure. And final question: SharePoint. Any thoughts on integration with SharePoint?
So depending on your PLM vendor, they offer solutions. So there's the Teamcenter community and other things, for SharePoint integration. But then also you can pretty easily adopt these types of links and external references if you like within a PLM system without a lot of configuration if you like, and you can use things in that way, or look for that commercial product provided by your PLM vendor, and they're both available. All right. So we'd like to follow up very quickly with some migration tools that we have. We want to discuss a little bit of DIY or DIY benefits. So there is going to be a lot of corporations want to take this out internally in their IT. We would advise that you think about the strategy and have some know-how already in mind before you embark on your migration project. Maybe you just want to bring somebody in for a little bit of project management. Certainly you know your data pretty well, and you know how to map these properties because you probably created them in the old and the new systems. But there's some, maybe there's some dependencies in or some project planning that you might have missed, and so certainly cost is definitely an issue in DIY. With the risk, does your team really have the skills, or do they have the time? And most of the time they have the skills. There is some programming and some APIs that you might need to work through, and you might not have all the expertise for that. You might not understand both systems very well internally in order to do that, and you might not have the time, because everybody who works on these projects typically has a full-time job already. And so you don't have the bandwidth for that, and you might not already have the expertise in order to do this type of work very easily. And if you don't, maybe you want to have some strategic guidance, or to have some services provided from outside. Make sure you allocate enough time if you do it yourself. Make sure you allocate enough resources. Understand what the project needs are going to be. Be realistic about that timeline. Plan hard, test hard, document the success, over-communicate, and use commercial tools. So it could be that you use some of our tools or some vendor tools or other tools that might make this a little bit easier. Our tool for migration is called PLM Migrate, and it is our OpenPDM platform. It's been around for around 20 years. It does very good analysis and does flexible structure. It can handle effectivities and variants and options and all sorts of things. It has high performance. It can transfer CAD, native CAD. It can do derivative formats. It can operate on CAD itself in order to create things and do CAD translation workflow engines, do bidirectional synchronization. It's not limited to a certain set of use cases like other vendors might have, but it's very flexible and open, and it's really robust process monitoring. It supports a wide variety of connectors. So that's included, at the bottom for PLM and PDM, like your Smart Team, your Novia, 3D Experience, VPM. We have great tools for VPM, Windchill, Intralink, Teamcenter Enterprise, Agile, Eigner, Autodesk, Aris, and then also, EKM and your STM integrations, ERP for SAP, Agile and Oracle. We have CAD connectors that do that CAD evaluation for Creo, CATIA, NX, and then also things like OSLC, like I was talking about, for ALM. There are some other connectors that are not on here as well for requirements, for other ALM systems, for other systems in general as well. So you could take those multiple sources of data, figure out in your strategy which one is the right one, and then populate your PLM with that and your migration with all our connectors. So, it's tried and tested, good parallel processing for large volumes of data, high quality assurance. We have lots of monitoring, KPIs, performance, we have the soft stop functions that will pause things. Whereas, a homegrown script is not going to have the feature set that's going to let you queue efficiently and do things like soft stops. It's going to be an all or nothing typically. We can make it modular within packages, do CAD conversion, and a lot of other great benefits, right? We're good at combining data. We understand all these different systems, and we have great access with our connectors to these different data sets that we can export and import in an automated fashion to make your stuff migrate well. Typically, high-level visualization is you have your source system. We have a connector for that system. We run either transactionally or in an ETL, an export of all that data. We manage that data, maybe massage that data in the middle, and then execute an import to the target system. We can do, delta comparison checks, make sure that we know when to update data, when to reuse data. We have tools that can provide that type of feedback and automate those processes based on different conditions. So in the end, we have that server in the middle and those connectors that can drive that migration. And package it in parallel, right? We can run as many parallel imports as your system can handle, is really what it comes down to. And we want to make it so that your system is running at 98% utilization in order to import that data. If we're going through in committing CAD and making sure that that works well. So we can run 10, 20, 30 processes in parallel in large package volume in order to make that happen. We support both a one-time migration and also the coexistence integration in both directions. So you can feed back data from your new system to your old one if you need to be live in both systems for a long period of time. And really, we're here to help. So we've got hundreds of PLM and CAD consultants, 25 years of experience, global, so we're all over the world, and we can support projects globally. We have a large standards-based history and good processes and methodology, commercial software that's been around for 20 years. We're very flexible about a lot of migration. You only need the system for 6 months, okay, rent it for 6 months. And all our connectors are certified by the vendors, and so they are vendor supported. If you get a Teamcenter connector, we have a partnership with Teamcenter that supports that connector, like we were talking about in the beginning. And really, we're here to help. So give us a call. We'd be glad to talk about strategy and be glad to talk about, your migration. Obviously, the obligatory Open PDM customers, these are customers that use Open PDM. And there's more that aren't on this list because of other concerns, and they don't want to, have the NDA or whatever. So finally, I'm going to turn it back over to Paul for some final questions, and we'd like to field any of them that are out there, and maybe provide some feedback and fill out the survey. Right?
Thanks, Brian. I'll give Brian's voice a rest here, but first of all, I want to thank all of you that have stayed on the call for so long. That we know an hour and a half is a long time. Typically, we do more like a 45-minute webinar, but in this case, we wanted to make this a little bit more interactive, and hopefully that worked well for us. I do see, one question out there that people have about our phone number. We've got a toll-free number, which is 8PROSTEP01. So pretty easy to remember for our toll-free number. Our website is PROSTEP.com, and you can also find all our contact information there. We'll stay on the line as long as you guys have questions, but really we're done at this point. Please take a second when we close out the webinar to answer our survey. Feel free, as Brian said, to reach us out at us anytime. And we are offering anybody who attended and made it this far your reward. Contact us anytime, and we're happy to do a free migration assessment workshop. We'll come out to your site wherever you are and spend a half day with you and your team and kind of help you through some of these issues, because it's complex stuff, right? And like Brian said, we're here to help. So with that, for the bulk of people, unless you've got some additional questions, we'll say goodbye, and we'll stay on here live for a minute or two and see if anybody else has some questions. So just raise your hand or chat if you do. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.